In his seminars on the Meno, Strauss says that most of us, most of the time, are memory men. So there's other side to the side that Nietzsche's getting to here, where he says we ought to forget for the sake of life. Has a strong example in things that we experience all the time these days, which is that the memory men means for instance, rote memory, and also what we learn in school early on. And one encounters this all the while is that the educated tend to, you have a compendium, a textbook compendium, you memorize that for the sake of advancing yourself, getting a certificate, advancing your career, and so on. And anybody who says anything, you have a training, you're trained. Anybody who says anything, the training is useful. It's obviously useful if we're passing tests. It's also useful in the sense that it can show you, for instance, the whole ins and outs of the legal world as understood in a certain genre, say the concept of the how the law is treated in Great Britain in the last 50 years, how to negotiate the courts under those specific conditions, and so on. So therefore, it's not as though what you learned were nothing. And in a certain sense, therefore, the contempt one feels for anyone who will contradict it has a actual meaning in the midst of life. But nonetheless, it excludes actual reflection and in the deepest sense, in the sense that Plato brings up. So Strauss speaks of in the Meno, and Strauss goes into this the concept of the sukarion, or the shrunken soul, comes in. We might be more familiar with that, with the word, the Latin word, or Latinate word, pusillanimous, which means the puny animus, or puny spirit, in contradistinction to the magnanimous, the great spirit. Magnanimous is often used in connection to Aristotle. But what the pusillanimous is somebody who is just a memory person, in the sense that we have all manner of phrases, in the sense well known to any student of the Platonic dialogues, and we just stick to them and we don't really question them. So this lack of questioning is in fact due to the positive condition of being a memory person. In fact, here's an example I was just thinking of, that we're all, in a sense, these memory people, and that we've accepted not in the sense of rote memory, but in the sense that we've grown into this, the common sense, as it were, of our age. Wouldn't anyone say that instead of historical men and last men, that we should translate historian mention as historical people? So aren't we compelled to regard that as a progress, that we speak of historical people, not historical men? I mean, otherwise we could say historical men and women, but we're compelled to say historical people in a way that seems to be an improvement, unless we want to claim that Nietzsche didn't think that way and therefore we shouldn't think that way. But if we're treating this as a live question rather than into an inquiry into Nietzsche's thinking, then it behooves us to think of it that way, historical people. So we all think in terms of this progress. I mean, for example, in the American law schools, it was so that at the time of Ruth Bader Ginsburg went to Harvard, it was only a very few people who had the grit, as it were, to go through that process and endure the discrimination against women at the time, and the fact that that was a novel thing at the time. But today, and one may say that for thousands and thousands of years, so far as the profession of the law has been of the most essential importance to the Western civilization, there were never women lawyers. But today there are more women lawyers produced in the American law schools than male lawyers. So then one has the feeling that these things are not mere matters of doctrine or of prescriptions that people simply adamantly commit themselves to out of idealism, but they're things that are actually transfiguring the whole world. So the memory, we see that the memory here has multiple meanings. Heidegger brings out, also I mentioned slightly out of context, but Heidegger brings out that Nietzsche makes this reflection that he doesn't act, around the time of the Zarathustra, Nietzsche, according to Heidegger, writes somewhere that maybe forgetfulness doesn't properly exist. Because how do we know? Because just right now we aren't thinking of something doesn't mean we couldn't recall it. Just because something right now isn't available to us doesn't mean that everything that happened in the past couldn't somehow be brought back. This, in a way, is a piece of evidence for Heidegger for his view of the importance of history, or at least it strikes to me that way. Further on the question of memory, we have to get into, Heidegger is going into all kinds of distinctions of forgetfulness and memory, and he's accused of misusing the German language by giving more distinctions to the different words for those things than actually occur in the language. But you can say this is his typical a way of bringing determinations to these ideas. And one of the reasons, I believe in general, one of the reasons people admire Heidegger is his way of going closer to the thoughts than most thinkers. Someone said most thinkers just talk about what other thinkers thought about. Heidegger shows you what they actually thought. There's a feeling, an objective in the sense that subjectively objective, let's say, in the sense that many people that study Heidegger experience the same thing. He seems to be bringing us closer to the thinking of other thinkers than almost anyone else does, perhaps than anyone else does, because even if Aristotle has the same power to go closer to the things, he doesn't use it generally in interpreting the texts of others, even if he here and there makes a few remarks about Plato or about the people who came before him. You can see that memory, in the sense of Socrates, is something remembering that which was before we were born, which corresponds largely to the sense of eros as that which draws us towards the truth. Is quite different from this sense of rote memory, which causes us to obstruct our journey to the truth and to stay with the practices that are now prevalent among the communities in which we move. I think in the Straussian sense, we can also see that so far as it is so that there's an orthodoxy, so what's an orthodoxy? Orthodoxy could mean a dogma in the sense of the Catholic Church, which didn't always have a bad name, which formerly meant that the thing that the most intelligent people have thought through the most thoroughly, and this is their opinion on it. But it can also mean the democratic orthodoxy in the sense of this is the view that's most prevalent, and therefore the view that is in a way in command of the scene. And the orthodoxy therefore does, and then you can see what Strauss means when he says that the Democrats and Republicans, for instance, in the American scene, both share an underlying unity in their starting place. They both start from this position where there's what Nietzsche is saying here, the historical men. They're all historical men. They all view this possibility of the meaning of existence will become ever clearer in the course of evolution. They look backward at the process only to understand the present and stimulate their longing for the future. So both sides want changes, both sides want improvement, both sides talk about the country building up, the country, the economic, more productive. Everything is basically from the Catholic point of view, you can say the issue is that man has now been interpreted as good. Human nature is good, but it just needs time to progress. And this is, one sees in the whole American system, one sees something more like the French rationalist system, which of course comes in for example, explicit examples more in some of the founding fathers than in Jefferson than in some of the others. But even there, even in Jefferson Hamilton, you see that the whole thing happens basically on the same plane of this the historical men who have then therefore forgotten themselves in this common sense, which is now everywhere in power. And Strauss wants us to become aware of this, so then we can ask whether we want to be one of them. And Nietzsche is here showing that there's two other positions. There's the what he calls the historicism, which is actually corresponds to what Nietzsche's calling here the Uber-historian mentioned, the super-historical men, Leopardi being the great example he gives. And then what may be preparing the way for the Ubermensch is his break from the super-historical men, the ones that regard historicism as true but deadly, and therefore, if it's deadly, then why shouldn't we break from it? This is also, again, I want to say, I don't believe it's correct to simply regard Nietzsche as being against the so-called quote-unquote resentment or resentiment, because, and then to say life is the antidote to the resentful view, which has brought us to all these problems. No, because there's a larger issue of the awareness of history involved, and also because he speaks of the death. He speaks explicitly of the life-giving lie, which implies that he believes actually the so-called the resentful ones is where I've come to the truth. But he's chosen out of the full consciousness of the problem to choose another direction, and I don't think it's actually. If I can try to think through it more clearly, I think we can give expression to a demonstration that this is not. It can't be shown in terms of right and left, where right and left mean the development from the time of Luther breaking with the church to the present day. I think it has a different ground to it.